how it works.
More or less, what we did was to encode meaning into a fabric which the computer could not only understand but could act on rapidly. So you and I might feel like we have a meaningful connection because we're interested in the same things.
Yeah.
Or you and I might feel like, I never got that guy. And how do you teach to the computer whether A is meaningful to B?
Right.
Well, it turns out what you can do is say, look, let's not start forward from meaning. Let's start backwards from what do you understand, computer? And one thing computers understand is matrices and linear algebra. Effectively, in mathematics, there are two things. By the way, this is an idea originally due to Paul Bressler, a mathematician. Shout out to an old colleague. And he said, when it comes down to it, there are only two things we really know how to do, which is calculus and linear algebra. So what they did is they took linear algebra and they said, we're going to encode A being meaningful to B if we can turn A and B into two vectors.
Yeah.
And the angle between them isn't that large in a very large vector space.
Yeah.
So, it's one thing to be in 3 dimensions where lots of vectors have small angles between them. But if you go into a really large vector space, it feels like a lot of the vectors that get shoved in there are going to generically be pretty close to perpendicular. So there's a lot of room. And again, I'm speaking vaguely.
Yeah.
So what they did is that they said, let's come up with all sorts of different ways in which A can be meaningful to B. Maybe they could be related by being family, or one could be an adjective and modifying a noun, or versus an adverb modifying a verb. And these are called attention heads.
Okay.
And so you come up with, let's say 100 or so attention heads, which are all the kinds of meaning that we can encode in language.
Right.
And
I'm sorry. So let's just take dog, for example.
Sure.
So would you, if you're in the beginning phases of creating an LLM, would you have to assign to dog attention heads? Would you have to say?
So the first thing, I've skipped a step. There's something that you might call encoding or embedding, or tokenization.
Tokenization.
Yeah. So the idea is that, you and I are complex things, but I could take a picture of you and suddenly I have a representation of you that has zeros and ones, and somebody could say, oh, I know Duncan.
Right.
Or I could just take your voice. I could take the Fourier transform of the sound patterns that come out of your mouth and say, oh, I know that voice.
Right.
That's Duncan.
Right.
So I start tokenizing you all over the place.
Right.
And then I encode that, because large language models aren't really about language. They're about tokens.
Right.
So now let's imagine that you have dog. Dog is a platonic abstraction. Does it refer to a golden retriever? Does it refer to the, clade canine, or who knows what? So you take the word dog, and let's imagine that it doesn't have any subunits, and you encode that and embed that in a large vector space so that there's some vector that represents dog.
Right.
Right? And then, you have the idea that you have a regular dog, but you might be specific. You might have a bitch in heat. And at some level, that is going to be encoded by shading it with some gender concept.
Right.
So what we're going to first do is we're going to take a bunch of tokens that have very little structure except for sort of semantic structure. And we're going to encode them directly. And then we're going to try to work with that, because if you say that dog won't hunt, and that's a political platform plank, you don't actually mean a dog. So it's unclear at the moment, what does dog mean?
Right.
Once you have these words or tokens encoded into the computer, then you try to figure out which tokens are meaningful to which other ones, using not syntax, but using context.
Right.
And so these contextual meanings are what are provided by these attention heads.
Okay.
And
got it.
Right. So now the idea is, if Elton John is singing "The Bitch Is Back," and Beyonce says, "Don't be a bitch, take it to the floor," that's not the same thing as a dog breeder.
Right. Right.
Right. And so you have to figure out, well, how are they using that word?
Right.
And
Yeah. Okay. Gotcha.
right. And so now what happens is that we pass over this structure with what look like asymmetric inner products. So there's a thing called the dot product, which A dot B is always equal to B dot A. And this is like a weird version where it isn't symmetric, because our language, in the case of true large language models, has a directionality to it. I can't just jumble up the words the way I can, let's say, Latin. Latin will allow me not to, or to ignore word order at a level that English is unforgiving. And so there's a sort of a weird notion of angle, and what we keep doing is searching for all the ways in which words are related to each other in a sentence. Because if I have a bunch of dependent clauses and independent clauses, I may have a Proustian sentence where two things are very far separated in terms of the words, but one modifies the other.
Gotcha. Yeah.
And once I've got a computer concept of meaning using this ridiculous way of assigning meaning, which is just angle.
Yeah.
I then ask, what word do you think comes next? And, this was used in advertising. For example, you would take a phrase that is naturally occurring and would link it to something that isn't naturally occurring. So, for example, Bud Light. If I said tastes great, what would you say?
I don't know.
The ad was less filling.
Oh yeah, less filling. Right.
Right. And so what happened was that you'd be over for Thanksgiving dinner and somebody would say, "Grandma, this tastes great." And somebody else would just, their brain would autocomplete and say, "Less filling."
Yeah, okay. Yeah.
Right. So it roboticized us.
Yeah.
And these language models are basically doing that. If I say, "Good morning, it's great to see
you."
Right. So the idea is that it turns out more or less that this is a lot of what we do with our day. We think we're thinking, we think we're having conversations, but we're not.
Yeah.
We're just having these pre-programmed, pre-scripted interactions.
Yes.
And so the really big discovery is that we don't think.
Yes.
It's not that the computers are thinking. The really big discovery is that we're doing almost no thought.
Okay.